And welcome into the Week 8 edition of the Fantasy Rankings versus Expert Consensus on Fantasy Pros. My name is Bradley Stalder. You can follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. And tonight I'm going to be going through and highlighting 8 players who I either believe are going to be higher than the consensus or lower than the consensus for Week 8. And we're officially halfway through the season, entering Week 8 of the fantasy football year. And perhaps the wildest storyline so far, the winner of this Week 8's Carolina-Atlanta matchup, they're going to have sole possession of first place in the NFC South Division with that 27-22 loss of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday night. Now, this is the coldest streak of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tom Brady era. And that's led to speculation that Tom Brady and other veteran players like Leonard Fournette will start to play fewer snaps or altogether cede starters work near the end of the season. Now, that didn't happen in Week 8. Leonard Fournette bounced back in a real way with more snaps and more targets and more routes than Rachaad White. But ranking Tampa Bay Buccaneers players, especially the fantasy relevant ones, are going to be they're not going to be cut as cut and dry moving forward. So this is a narrative I think worth monitoring as we move on into Week 9 and beyond. Now, as for the Fantasy Pros Accuracy Rankings contest, I've had some success so far. I finished 56th last week out of about 200 rankers, so I was in the top quarter or so, which is fine. And entering Week 8, I'm 24th overall in accuracy out of 211 total rankers year to date. And that's including being the 9th most accurate ranker according or for wide receivers. And right now I'm 6th in IDP ranking accuracy. Now, I am starting to feel a little bit of urgency because I want to get into the top 10 this year. So I think I'm going to start being a little more aggressive. You're going to start seeing a few more of these rankings be more aggressive and me taking stronger stands on players that maybe and especially the consensus is not having. And so I'm doing this partly because, you deserve more bold takes, but also because I want to win. And the only way to win is to win big in these larger, 200, you're not ranking against your buddy, you're ranking against 200 people who do know what they're talking about in this industry. But the difference between the number 10 ranker this week and the number 55 ranker was only 18 spots in differential in accuracy gap. So making bigger and more correct calls continues to accumulate an edge. And that's what I want to do is in Week 8 and beyond, hopefully that will start to make a difference of not just being top 24 of over 200, but get me into that elite tier of top 10. So that's going to be something intentionally you'll start to notice as well as I am making my rankings. Especially in this article, you'll start to see bolder calls. So just a reminder that I also take part in advising Fantasy Data's weekly rankings. They're an excellent resource for anyone looking to win their league, along with player projections and advanced metrics. I use Fantasy Data all the time. In fact, it's my main source for getting exactly what it says, fantasy sports data. So if you want to get in on this fantasy data, use the data that that helps inform my rankings and projections. And the fantasy footballers use it. JJ Zacharyson uses it. Matthew Berry uses it. You should use it too. I use fantasy data. So follow me on this journey today. Use the promo code FFF20, and that will give you 20% off the subscription. So for fantasy data, any size subscription, large, small, the promo code is FFF20, 20% off your subscription to fantasy data. Now, I want to take that moment, do the promo, and then get into my higher ranked quarterback for Week 8, and that's Andy Dalton. And you're thinking to yourself, but Bradley, you're chasing fantasy points from last week. I'm not chasing the fantasy points from last week. I promise. Andy Dalton, he did finish as the quarterback 2 in Week 7, even without Jarvis Landry, Michael Thomas. He finished quarterback 2 despite not having those players. And it's not the fantasy points that I'm chasing from week 7. It's the matchup in week 8 that I'm chasing. It's about the vision. It's not going backwards. It's going forwards. And in the forward projection of Andy Dalton, he gets the Las Vegas Raiders, who give up the most fantasy points, second most passing touchdowns, and 7th most passing yards to quarterbacks on the season through the first 7 games. For reference, okay, no quarterback against the Raiders has finished with fewer than 19 fantasy points, fewer than 237 pass yards, or fewer than 2 passing touchdowns. Andy Dalton also gets Chris Olave. It was his first game back from concussion, still had 14 targets in the last week's game against Arizona. Olave's fully healthy, recovered from the concussion, and I think this game script is also something to take note of. This is ranked as the second highest over-under on the slate. I believe it's 50.5, 51.5 total points. So the points are going to be scored in this game between the Raiders and the Saints. And additionally, the Saints are 7th in pace of play. They're getting a lot of plays done pretty quickly. And the Raiders are middle of the pack. They're 17th. So you've got one fast team and one middle team. They're going to keep cranking. Okay. And that sets up for a higher volume of plays, more passing plays, and more plays down the field too. If you're getting more plays, you're more likely to get some down the field. And finally, it's clear that this is Andy Dalton's role. Jameis Winston is healthy for week 8. He's fully recovered, and yet Andy Dalton remains the starter. There's confidence that the Saints have in Andy Dalton to win games. And this is a bold call, but he is the consensus quarterback 20. I've moved Andy Dalton all the way up to quarterback 6 for the week. I know it's a bold call, but to win these matchups, win these contests, you got to go bold. And this is the matchup to do it. Jose jumps on the live stream. Good evening. Good evening, Jose. So I'm jumping on the fantasy data live stream. And then later tonight, I'm going to do a live stream on the Best Bell Fantasy YouTube as well. But tonight is the fantasy. Right now is the fantasy data one. And speaking of fantasy data, my rankings versus ECR article just dropped as well. So if you want to see not only these players laid out and the reasons why I think they're going to do better or worse than the expert consensus, check out the article. You can go to Fantasy Data. I believe it is behind the paywall, so you're going to need a subscription. You can use the promo code FFF20 for 20% off your Fantasy Data subscription. Click on the site. Go there, find the article, and you can see for yourself the rest of these. Okay, so Andy Dalton is the quarterback that I'm higher on this week pretty significantly, but let's move to a quarterback that I am lower on relative to the expert consensus, and that's Jimmy Garoppolo. Garoppolo is the quarterback 14 in expert consensus. He is my quarterback 20. And surprisingly, Jimmy Garoppolo has been a top 9 quarterback each of the last 3 weeks. And he's faced off against the Panthers, Falcons, and the Chiefs. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, Panthers, Falcons, Chiefs, maybe a few good matchups. No, these are really cushy matchups. The Falcons give up the 2nd most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. The Chiefs give up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. And the Panthers, they've played quarterbacks pretty tough, middle of the pack, but they give up the 13th most passing yards to quarterbacks on the season. So there's not like you weren't afraid of the Carolina Panthers. The matchup changes. This is a significant shift in difficulty in play or willingness to give up quarterback fantasy points against the 49ers, or when the 49ers face off against the Rams. The Rams only give up 13.1 fantasy points per game, the 8th fewest passing touchdowns and the 8th fewest passing yards. This is not a spike week formula or spike week matchup for Jimmy Garoppolo. And in fact, when Jimmy G played against the Rams in week 4, he finished as the quarterback 22, going 16 for 27. He only had 239 passing yards and only 14 fantasy points. Not only is it a tough matchup, and not only has Jimmy Garoppolo struggled already this year against this defense, but Deebo Samuel was ruled out this week, so that's going to also limit the upside of Jimmy Garoppolo against this Rams defense. Jimmy Garoppolo is my quarterback 20, and again, he is the quarterback 14 in consensus. So instead of being a high-end quarterback 2, he's more of a mid to back-end quarterback 2 for me in this matchup. Are y'all excited? Y'all excited for week 8? You know what week 8's going to be? It's going to be Tony Pollard week. That's right. Tony Pollard, the consensus running back 14, is my quarterback 5 at least. I might even move him up a little higher as we get closer to Sunday. But in the only game that Tony Pollard's career where he's played at least 60% of snaps, he rushed 12 times for 69 yards, so averaged 5.5 yards a carry. He scored 2 rushing touchdowns. He caught 6 passes on 9 targets for 63 yards. He finished as the running back number 2 in half-point scoring that week, with Ezekiel Elliott listed as doubtful and trending toward not playing. Pollard projects as a mid running back 1. And I don't think the consensus has caught up yet. I think there's still some hesitancy. And I mean, even in a part-time role, we've seen a floor for Tony Pollard, and we've also seen a ceiling. He's finished as a top 29 running back each of the last 3 weeks, so at least that floor is there. And 5 of the last 6 weeks include the number 3 overall running back finish week 2 against Cincinnati. This matchup also is good against this Dallas offensive line, or for this Dallas offensive line versus the Chicago defensive line. The Dallas offensive line is projected by Pro Football Focus to have an 8% run block advantage. And additionally, the Chicago Bears have given up almost 23 fantasy points per game to the running back this season. That is 6th most in the NFL. And with no other real notable running back on the depth chart, I mean, Malik Davis, maybe Rico Dawdle's on IR, right? There, maybe someone's going to be elevated from the practice squad, but Pollard will rank in the top 5 running backs this week. He can catch passes. He's dynamic. I mean, we could go through all of the metrics, but we see it on the tape. I don't need to read those metrics for you. Tony Pollard, he's not going to be the running back 14. He'll get into that running back 1 tier for you. Play him with confidence. Get him off your bench. Put him in your starting lineup this week. It's Tony Pollard week, everybody. Now, the running back that I am lower on this week, and it's more of a tier drop. You're treating Nick Chubb as a back end running back 1, high end running back 2 in this matchup against Cincinnati for Monday Night Football. He's still going to stick in your lineup. Maybe you move him to your flex spot. If you have a running back in your flex spot, you move him up. It's just the smart thing to do with the Monday night games. But Chubb is on pace for a career year. He's on a trajectory for a career high in rushing yards, total touchdowns, and fantasy points per game. He's crushing this year. And deservedly, like, this ranking of running back 4, that's merited, right? People want to be hyped for Nick Chubb, but I'm just going to poke a little bit of a hole in there. I know he leads all running backs in rush yards, total touchdowns, evaded tackles, breakaway runs, and expected points added. There's a lot of good things that Nick Chubb has done this year, but the Bengals don't give up a lot of fantasy points to the running back position. In fact, they only give up 16 fantasy points per game to the whole position. And Kareem Hunt, doesn't go away. So that's the 5th fewest in the NFL, that's 16 points per game. Additionally, they only give up about 80 rushing yards per game, 4 yards per carry. That is 6th fewest in the NFL. But what's even more impressive, not just that the Bengals aren't giving up a lot of rushing yards and are not giving a lot of rushing yards per carry, but they tighten up around the goal line. The Cincinnati Bengals have given up the 3rd fewest rushing touchdowns on the year, and they allow the 4th lowest touchdown percentage on carries within the 5-yard line. The Bengals are favored against the Browns in Cleveland. And so I think it's this game script that is going to work in against Chubb's favor. I think that with Joe Burrow teeing up with T. Higgins, that's going to be a major down the field matchup. And I think that there's going to be some points scored in this game, but we're going to move Nick Chubb down just a little bit given that it has been more difficult for teams to convert against Cincinnati when it gets to the goal line. Chubb has finished outside the top 10 of running backs in 4 of his 7 games. 3 of those 4 games were during losses. So for this game, it's against Cincinnati. Lowering expectations just slightly for Nick Chubb seems appropriate. He's my running back 11. You're not starting Nick Chubb, okay? He's gonna be in your starting lineup. It's just a matter of, you can't be having as high of expectations for him, and maybe he's more of a DFS fade for you. My higher wide receiver on the week, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, St. Brown was primed for a massive week 7. Coach Campbell came out and said he's going to handle as many targets as he can. I mean, it's Amon-Ra St. Brown. But he had to leave early in week 7, and this crushed me in my top prop fantasy. It crushed me in my FFWC Showdown League. Amon-Ra St. Brown last week 7, that really hurt me. But Coach Dan Campbell stated that St. Brown did not sustain a concussion despite having to leave early due to the enhanced concussion protocols. He's ready to roll week 8. I know he's listed as questionable. He's trending to play. And he goes against Miami. And as we note, this is going to be a plus matchup for wide receivers. It's a high over-under on the week. I'll get to that in a second. But Miami allows the 8th most fantasy points, 30.3. 9th most touchdowns, and 11th most yards to wide receivers. But even with dealing with an ankle injury and ataxia, St. Brown still ranks 2nd among all wide receivers in target rate, 34.5%. So he ranks 2nd in target rate, 2nd in fantasy points per route run, and 11th in fantasy points per game. Take out those 2. So he's 11th in fantasy points per game, but take out the 2 games he played like 15 and 30% of snaps. If we do that, if we take out the games where he left early due to injury, he's averaging 18.3 half point PPR, half point per game. That is a top 4 rate on the season. And as I said, this game is a high over under 51.5. So I think a shootout could be in the works for this Lions offense. We know St. Brown is going to get about a third of the targets. Additionally, like this presence of DeAndre Swift, I think actually opens up the offense. I think it makes it so that defenders have to be honest in passes and routes run close to the line of scrimmage. So St. Brown, my wide receiver 5 on the week, he's wide receiver 12. And I think there's still just some hesitancy that he's going to leave the game early, but there's no indication that, he's had any setbacks, no issues with the concussion protocol. So I think we're full wheels up for Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is a good matchup. He's done well when he's been out there, and you should just play Amon-Ra St. Brown with confidence as a mid-tier wide receiver 1. My lower wide receiver for the week, Tyler Lockett. And he's facing the Giants defense, and the Giants defensive backs have been a tough task this year. They've only given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, the 3rd fewest receiving touchdowns, 4th fewest receptions, 6th fewest receiving yards. And I know DK Metcalf is projected to miss this game, but even increased targets for Lockett this season has not necessarily led to more fantasy points. In fact, in games this season, when Lockett has at least 8 targets, there are 4 games, Lockett averages 7 receptions and 80 yards, which you're thinking to yourself, okay, like that gets me 11 points, 11, 12 points in half PPR. Yeah, that's not going to get you wide receiver 16. That's going to get you closer to like wide receiver 30. Okay. Now, is there a chance that he gets a touchdown? Yeah. But he only has 2 touchdowns on the season, and my concern is the touchdowns itself. Geno's only thrown 11 touchdowns in 7 games so far this season. A lot of them to the tight ends, right? Noah Fant, Will Dissly, Colby Parkinson. They all have touchdowns this year. And so I am concerned about the touchdowns. I'm also concerned about the pace of play. The Seahawks rank 21st in pace of play. The Giants rank 22nd. So it's not like one team is going to push and then the other team is slow. They're both just going to weasel their way through. Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Walker. It's going to be a run first offense for not only Seahawks, but also for the Giants. So I think that's going to be playing a factor into not a lack of a boom week for Tyler Lockett. And finally, bizarrely, the home road splits for Lockett are really stark this year. Lockett's averaging the wide receiver 23 on the road, but at Lumen Field, he is on average the wide receiver 57 this year, and he plays at Lumen Field in Seattle. So Lockett is my wide receiver 25. I want to be lower than consensus. I'm not buying into, well, DK loses 30% of the targets, therefore Tyler Lockett's going to get a massive target. Tyler Lockett's already getting a massive target share. It's probably that Marquise Goodwin is going to get a couple more targets. Maybe, Eskridge, Dwayne Eskridge, D. Eskridge is going to get a little bit more run. Maybe Bo Melton will get a couple snaps. I'd love Bo Melton to get some snaps. But Tyler Lockett, he's going to be a back end wide receiver 2, not a high to mid wide receiver 2 for you this week. You have to change tiers. And I am concerned that Lockett's not going to boom this week. Giants are a real tough defense for against wide receivers. My higher ranked tight end for the week, Irv Smith Jr. And if this isn't the week for Irv Smith's breakout, I don't know when it's going to come, honestly. While Smith hasn't had this huge breakout yet, he's trending that way into a favorable matchup. Smith played his highest snap share of the year in week 6. Minnesota's on a bye. He's well rested. He's ready to roll. He played 69% of snaps, and he's eclipsed 60% of snaps each of the last 3 weeks going into that week 7 bye, and now going into week 8. Smith is 10th among tight ends in red zone targets. He missed a week. 9th in total touchdowns. Once again, he's had his bye. 4th in target separation. But Irv Smith ranks 21st with 3.8 fantasy points per game and a half-point scoring. The Cardinals, squaring off against the Vikings in week 8, give up 16.9 fantasy points per game to the tight end on the season. That is the second most among all defenses. And last Thursday, Juwan Johnson finished with 5 receptions, 2 of them turning into touchdowns against the Cardinals. He finishes the tight end 2. And an elite ceiling game is within the range of outcomes for Irv Smith. It's not like, oh, we're projecting. It's not a Harrison Bryant situation where we've only seen one real explosion game for Harrison Bryant. I'm ranking Irv Smith significantly ahead of Harrison Bryant for this week. The reason why, over the last 19 games, Irv Smith has had 4 such games where he's finished as the tight end 4 or higher. So not only is like a top 10 within his range of outcomes, top 5 is within the range of outcomes for Irv Smith Jr. He's shown that ceiling not just once, not just twice, but 4 times over the last 19 games in a week where Travis Kelce and Gerald Everett are on a bye, and I expect David Njoku to miss due to the high ankle sprain. Irv Smith Jr. slots in as my tight end 5 this week, tight end 5. Finally, my lower ranked tight end for the week, Dawson Knox. And I tell you what, chasing touchdowns, that's a dangerous game. Knox finished with 9 touchdowns in 15 games last season, but he's only had 1 singular score through his first 5 contests. And that's not surprising given his 10.5% target share, only 9.7% red zone share. It just hasn't translated into big fantasy point games, despite the Buffalo Bills being this offensive juggernaut that we know that they are. Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, even Isaiah McKenzie's had some big games. Khalil Shakir has gotten in on the mix, but Dawson Knox has not. Knox ranks tight end 33 in yards per route run. 33. There are only 32 starting tight ends in the NFL. He's 25th among tight ends in yards per team pass attempt, tight end 30 in fantasy points per route run. And with that low target share, a mediocre target distance, it's not like he's getting targeted way down the field. He's only tight end 14 in target distance, and his decreased route participation from last year. The consensus optimism for Dawson Knox, I don't get it. It seems out of place. And especially this week against the Packers. The Packers are a tough defense against tight ends. He's going to find it difficult to score fantasy points. The Packers only allow 3 receptions, less than 29 receiving yards, and they haven't allowed a tight end touchdown yet this year. Knox will continue to play the majority of tight end snaps, I think, over Quentin Morris. Although, wouldn't it be irony that Quentin Morris gets the touchdown this week for the Buffalo Bills instead of Dawson Knox? Wouldn't that be the comedic irony? But here we are. Just because Dawson Knox, I project to play more snaps than Morris, though, doesn't mean he's a starter. I don't know why he's tight end 13. There's a lot of projection and wishful thinking from the fantasy world. Knox is my tight end 23. It's okay. You can drop him in certain leagues. Like, you don't need to play Dawson Knox, much less this week against the Green Bay Packers. All right, that will do it for today. I want to make sure that you are checking out my article, fantasydata.com/fantasy rankings versus ECR week 8. And that is behind the paywall. So I want to remind you, use the promo code FFF20, and that will get you a subscription to any size subscription for fantasy data. The promo code FFF20, 20% off. And so use that subscription to inform yourself better, make better decisions in fantasy football. If you want to use projections, DFS, they've got an optimizer. And not just football. There's PGA, MLB, right? Of course, the NFL, NBA that's just kicked off. Fantasy Data is your source for exactly that, fantasy data. Use the promo code FFF20. JJ Zachariason uses it. Matthew Berry uses it. The fantasy footballers use it. I use it. Right now, I'm 24th overall in the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings out of over 200 rankers. So I use it. I'm successful. You know those other names of the fantasy football industry as well. They use fantasy data. Use the promo code FFF20 and set yourself up for success for the back half of the fantasy year and beyond. All right, that'll do it for tonight's live stream. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate you jumping in. And you can follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. Until next time, good luck in week 8, everybody.